Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session today for the prospects of US-Pakistan relations, which will be with Maliha Lodhi and Cameron Munter, and will be moderated by Umair Saeed.
Thank you. We were going to, just to give you a brief outline, we'll have a short statements by Ambassador Lodhi and Ambassador Munter to begin with for the first 20 minutes. After that, we'll have a three-way discussion, and the last 20 minutes will be a Q&A session. So we wanted to have plenty of time for your concerns. To briefly introduce our guests, Ambassador Cameron Munter was a US ambassador to Pakistan from October 2010 to July 2012. He served during a time of rising tensions and a very critical stage between US-Pakistan relations, and at a time when there were speculation and there were rumors that things are headed for a very drastic change in relations. So he served at a very critical time, and the worst seems to have passed, I'm sure partly thanks to the ambassador's efforts. Prior to this appointment, he was an advisor on political and military issues to the US ambassador to Iraq. He holds a PhD in history from the Johns Hopkins University, and before joining the Foreign Service, he taught history in university. He has been known as a good friend of Pakistan, and he has called for a rethink in US policy towards Pakistan, and recently questioned the way the US handled the Salalah incident, in which close to 24 Pakistani soldiers were killed in a friendly fire incident. But we'll discuss that later. The other guest is Ambassador Maliha Lodhi, who was a leading journalist of Pakistan, and before taking the position of ambassador of Pakistan to the US, she has also been ambassador to the UK, and then later again as ambassador to the US. She also holds a PhD from LSE and has taught at Quaid-e-Azam universities and LSE before becoming a journalist. Just a brief overview of our discussion. Pakistan and US have had a long history of tumultuous relations. Starting in the 50s, Pakistan had its own objectives of engaging with the US to equalize its relationship with India, and the United States had a different set of objectives in terms of its containment policy towards the USSR. So given the two sides had different objectives, there's always been some tension and some dissatisfaction on both sides. There's a Pakistani narrative that the US has not been a reliable ally and not been there when we needed them the most in our conflicts with India, especially in 65 and 71. And the US has felt that Pakistan has taken military assistance intended to further security in South Asia and has used it for other reasons in its conflict with India. The Soviet invasion got the relationship back together, but it did not last long. And shortly after the Soviet left Afghanistan, a relationship was triggered by the nuclear program, broke down once again. 9/11 led to a revival of the relationship, but the Pakistani policymakers continued to see the relationship through the prism of the infamous Pressler Amendment, which triggered the end of the relationship last time around. The US, on the other hand, has not been satisfied with the support Pakistan received in Afghanistan, and has always been the so-called do more has been the refrain in the US policy, even though that's ended now. Currently, that's where we stand. The Afghan war is coming to an end. Other disputes between US and other issues like NPT, nuclear issue, non-proliferation, are not the main issues right now. Right now, the main issue is Afghanistan. What is the nature of the alliance? What is Pakistan's Afghan policy? What should be the Afghan's policy? Has the US been sufficiently sympathetic to Pakistan's concerns? And so on and so forth. Is the Pakistan really guilty of being deceptive towards the US? Or is the US is guilty of not being sympathetic to Pakistan? So these are the things we're going to be discussing in more detail. So there are many questions facing Pakistan, especially now that the Afghan war is ending. Is the relationship going to continue, or will there be problems like last time? So without further ado, I hand over to Ambassador Lodhi, who's going to present her point of view, and followed by Ambassador Munter.
Thank you, Umair. Assalamu alaikum. and a very good afternoon to everyone. I thought it would be appropriate to start with a minute's silence for the tragedy that occurred in Quetta yesterday. So let us all say a prayer.
Yes.
Thank you, Umair. I see Amina has joined us, and I want to really tell her what an extraordinary job she's done. I think she needs a big hand right now, and not later. I've had the privilege of attending all but one of the previous festivals, and I think this one really outshines them all. You do it better every time. We're so proud of you. So let me start. You've given me about 10 minutes, and I'll try to stick to that.
Roughly.
Roughly, very rough. Let me start by saying, or posing a question. And the question is, Pakistan and the United States fell out, disagreed, over waging war in Afghanistan, over the way it was conducted, and the shifting goals and changing objectives that Pakistan saw the United States pursue. So the question is, if they fell out over waging war, will waging peace bring them together? And I think we can return to that. But really, before looking at the future, I want to briefly recall the past, because we can't understand the future unless we at least make a reference to the turbulence in tires in the last 2 years. This was not new, but it was unprecedented even by the standards of the roller coaster history of the relationship, which has always seen ups and downs. It's seen peaks and valleys, and it's seen periods of engagement followed by periods of estrangement. So that wasn't new. What was new, of course, was the fact that this engagement and estrangement was happening at the same time. And of course, by the many descriptions of what happened in the last 2 years, the terms that were used to describe the relationship, I think we can gauge that something was terribly wrong. And let me just say a little about some of these descriptions. They're quite interesting. One description was, are they frenemies? Neither friends nor enemies, but frenemies. This is the world's most neurotic, friendly relationship. This is a dysfunctional partnership. This is a shotgun marriage. They share the same bed, but they dream different dreams. And then there was one which I remember, Ambassador Munter would remember that too, from the Atlantic magazine, which called our country the ally from hell. Well, I'm glad you know what hell is like, because we still don't. But I think the defining paradox of recent years was this. Brought together by mutual need, the two countries remained separated by a gulf of mistrust and suspicion. Both, in fact, had a mirror image of each other. Both felt that they had given so much and got so little. Both felt that the other was behaving in a manner insensitive to their core interests. And both saw frustrated days and diminishing returns from the relationship. And Pakistan saw even a transactional relationship increasingly become a coercive one. But I think in some ways the crisis had a salutary effect, if I can put it that way, because both countries came out of this crisis of 2011, partly 2012, with a fresh set of eyes, because both sought a reset with a clearer idea of each other's red lines. And even when these red lines clashed, as for example on the use of the drones, there was at least a desire to try to talk about this rather than talk past each other. Not that this issue has been resolved. And B, there was a recognition on the part of both countries that ties really needed to be put on a more realistic basis, with less expectations, scaled down ambitions and expectations, so that a new equilibrium could be defined, which was more modest and better grounded. Certainly, the post-9/11 relationship was over. It ended in 2011 with the attack on Salalah. And C, I think it gave both countries, the crisis that I've been talking about, the pause to really reflect also on what they could have done differently, on their mistakes, and actually also on what they really wanted from the relationship. So I think with that backdrop, if we look ahead, to my mind at least 3 or 4 areas will be critical in shaping the relationship in the months and the years to come. First, most immediate, and in this relationship, the urgent has always taken precedence over the important. And the urgent in this case is how the Afghan endgame for the United States. For us, there is no endgame. We can't move out of this neighborhood. If we could, I think our country would have moved out a long time ago. But because we can't, I think getting the endgame right in the sense that the United States means it is going to be very important in how it affects the relationship. And I think here, the two countries and how they manage what is called the 2014 transition is also going to affect their future ties. I think they've made a constructive start in the last few months because we already have between our two countries an MOU in place which will help in the United States and NATO forces exit out of Pakistan's land route. Almost 60%, and don't hold me to that figure, that's the figure today, it could change tomorrow, of heavy equipment will actually leave through Pakistan's land route because there's no other way to take it out. The Salang tunnel doesn't quite do it, it's a tunnel. So I think this, as well as the aspect that the two countries have in the last few months been engaged in behind-the-scenes discussions to see how they can put in place an Afghan peace process, which can bring an end, among other things, to the fighting well ahead of 2014. If people are going to wait till 2014 to end the war, I'm afraid the risk and the danger is that might never happen. Secondly, I think future ties will be influenced and depend on how even-handed and balanced the United States policy is in the region that we call South Asia. Because lack of even-handedness, even if it is the law of unintended consequences, can be destabilizing for the nascent Indo-Pakistan peace process. So America has to operate and tread very carefully. Third, what will affect the relationship is the US pivot to, or rebalancing as the US itself wants to call it now, to Asia. Now this is regarded, this pivot or this refocusing of US attention is regarded by many people or many countries in Asia as a policy to contain China. Certainly the Chinese see it that way. So I think the strategies the US will follow, whether it wants to build up other countries as strategic counterweights to a rising China, will have an effect on our relationship. Because for Pakistan, its only strategic friend ever has been China. And most decisively, fourthly, ties will be affected by how Pakistan handles its own affairs. We often don't talk about this. We talk about foreign policy as if it's disconnected from domestic policy. It isn't. It cannot be. So how Pakistan manages governance, manages the economy, and meet its own security challenges will have a huge impact on how it is able to deal with the relationship with the United States. And with that in mind, I would like, instead of going into crystal ball gazing, really propose a number of do's and don'ts for the relationship. And this is based as much on my understanding of where we are right now and what we have been through, as well as my own long years of dealing with this relationship, both as a diplomat and as a writer. So I have 5 don'ts and 5 do's. So with your permission, may I continue?
Absolutely.
The first don't, I think, is don't pretend you are in a strategic embrace when relations are actually in transition. So don't look for strategic bonds if there aren't any. Don't overreach and overstate the relationship so that it can be more businesslike and therefore more workable. I think that way we will avoid false expectations and disappointments on both sides. The second don't treat differences as a reason to demonize. I think Pakistan has been at the receiving end in this matter, but I realize that Ambassador Munter spoke about these clashing narratives yesterday, and yes, they are, of course, clashing narratives. But I think my don't really refers to the fact that there will be differing priorities. The two countries will not have the same priorities going forward. They don't have the same priorities right now. But these priorities will have to be accepted rather than used as a basis to build a negative narrative against the other. Because I think the narrative that has been built against Pakistan in the last few years, and many of you travel all the time, you don't have to travel very far actually, all you have to do is switch on your television screens, and you see how damaging it is been for Pakistan. Ally from hell, double gamer, can't be trusted, fickle. I mean, I can't even remember all the adjectives that are used about our great country. The third don't conduct your relations through the media. It is true that we live in an era of unprecedented transparency, and that's a good thing. It's to be welcomed. But that doesn't mean that the powerful country mounts pressure on the less powerful one through leaks and statements which are, at the very least, provocative. And these are attributed often to anonymous officials. I think this can be eventually quite self-defeating. It doesn't really help the country which does that. My fourth don't, and I think this is an important one for the people of Pakistan and for the future government of Pakistan, which is don't view Pakistan through the single prism of Afghanistan. I think the first Obama administration had an Afghan policy, but it never had a Pakistan policy. All it did was to subordinate the relationship with Pakistan to the war in Afghanistan. Now, of course, the war was important, and of course, that was a dimension of the relationship. But when it became all of the relationship, I think we ran into lots of problems. So the second Obama administration that we hope Senator Kerry, now Secretary of State Kerry, will play a leading role, will be able to form and formulate a Pakistan policy which recognizes the intrinsic importance of Pakistan and doesn't just see the country as a subset or a derivative or a function of something else. A bilateral relationship should be sought for its own sake, not for the sake of factors extraneous to that bilateral relationship, even if that issue has to be worked. My fifth don't, and I'm sure you spoke about this yesterday also, which is don't reduce this relationship to a transactional one. This will neither bring respect nor joy. So for the United States, don't treat Pakistan as hired help. Too often, Pakistan is made to feel like it's hired help. And for Pakistan also, it should avoid being treated as hired help by weaning itself off aid. An aid relationship distorts ties and it distorts expectations. I think Pakistan cannot be wanting unlimited assistance from one hand and then expecting to be treated in a different manner. Anybody who's a recipient of this kind of money, and if that's all you ever do when you land up in Washington, well, then the paradigm, I'm afraid, will continue. It's sad, it's unfortunate, we can complain about it, but that's life. So to break from this paradigm, we must break the money part of the relationship. That will bring honor and pride, and that will also force Pakistan's self-absorbed and selfish political elites to actually reform this country, which is what this country needs. No country has been built on the basis of foreign aid. Countries are always built on the basis of their own effort. And then, let me turn to the 5 do's. And I know I'll run out of time when I do. The do's are basically not different from what perhaps Ambassador Munter was also talking about yesterday. Do predicate relations on where interests converge. So the relationship should be about interests, not about money. Build ties which are centered on areas of mutual interest. And there are significant shared interests. We have significant shared interests in defeating terrorism, stabilizing Afghanistan, promoting peace and security in South Asia, helping to avert and avoid an arms race, a nuclear arms race in particular in our region. There are lots of shared interests. Pakistan also will always be the second largest, or maybe it won't be, it may be the largest Muslim country, second largest Muslim country in the world. So its intrinsic importance is not something that's going to go away. Nor will geography. I mean, we can change history, but we can't change geography, as I said earlier. So geography and location, which has imposed such heavy burdens on Pakistan, will still mean that Pakistan is located where it is. My second do is that once you've identified what your convergent interests are, then act on them. together, preferably. And if you can't, then on your own. Because if these are shared interests, then you should be able to pursue them. My third do is to pursue a more broad-based engagement so that relations don't have a single pivot. They've often, in periods of intense engagement, have had only one pivot, security, understandably. But I think we need to look ahead now and see how the relationship can be more broad-based. And that engagement also, on both sides, is across society and not just with narrow elites. People-to-people relations, as we know from our own experience and from history, are always more long-lasting than government-to-government relationships. So unless that element is there, the relationship will always be fraught or subject to tensions. My fourth do is to accept that there will be areas of differences. And persuasion may narrow the gap, but no amount of coercion will, nor the imposition of the stronger side's security needs at the expense of the other country's sovereignty and interests. I mean, by virtue of being powerful, you can demand certain things, but don't expect the weaker country to act that way if it thinks that acting that way is contrary to its interests. And my fifth do is to be as transparent with one another as possible and listen to the other, even if you can't agree with them, agree to disagree, but at the same time, have the patience. And I know Washington is a city of short memory spans and short attention spans, but it'd be nice if somebody goes and visits Washington for people to listen, and for the Pakistani side also equally to listen, even if we disagree. So let me end by where I started, which is that an opportunity presents itself after a period of great turbulence in the relationship between Pakistan and the United States, collaborating on ending the war in Afghanistan, where the two countries today want roughly the same outcome. In fact, maybe roughly is not right. They want the same outcome. They would like to see an end to Afghanistan being used as a haven for terrorist networks or for the regeneration of terrorist networks. They'd like a stabilized Afghanistan, a stabilized border, so does Pakistan. And of course, nobody wants 2014 to be another 1989, that fateful year when the Soviets withdrew, and we know what happened. As they say, the rest is history. Neither the United States wants that, nor Pakistan wants to see 2014 turn into a 1989. So I think this is a very solid basis for a genuine, open, and constructive engagement between the two countries. Working together, as I said, to wage peace will come more easily to Pakistan than working together to wage war. And here I'm reminded of a line from a movie I saw. And if you haven't seen it, please do. It's a very powerful film. It's called Lincoln. It's after a very great American president. And I saw this movie and I was very struck by many things, but this is the line that struck me because I thought it was very appropriate as we talked about shifting from war to peace. And it is spoken in the movie by Lincoln himself. And he is speaking as an end to America's civil war is approaching. And he says this, quote, "Are we ready for peace? For when it comes, it will present us with conundrums and dangers greater than any we faced during the war, bloody as it has been. We will have to extemporize and experiment with what it is and when it is," unquote. So I think in the relationship, too, as we move towards peace, we hope, in the region, for us to figure out what it is and when it is remains a work in progress, but it will be a challenge no less imposing than the one we faced when we conducted this unfortunate war that brought so much grief to people in this region, to the people of Pakistan, and to many people, actually, in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lodi. Ambassador Munter.
Well, I'm delighted to have the chance. Am I on? No. Is it on? No? Is it on? Now it's on. Yes? No. Hello? His... Let's try again. Okay, now it's on. I'm delighted to have the chance to follow Maleeha Lodhi, as I have done for the entire time that I've been working on Pakistan, because she is someone eminently worth following. And I don't mean simply following in a path of diplomatic achievement, but an intellectual and a conceptual path that I think is fruitful, honest, and critical of oneself and critical of others in the way that the best tradition of public speaking can come. Before I begin, once again, my thanks again to Amina and the team from Oxford University Press for a fabulous program here, to the people at the Avari who have been so good in taking care of us, and once again, thanks to all of you for taking part. You're the sinews of this whole process, and the people I've been able to talk to and discuss with have really been a joy here. Those of you who's heard me speak yesterday realize that Maleeha Lodhi and I are talking in many ways about many of the same projects, many of the same prospects, many of the questions that come up as we reach a certain historical juncture in our relationship. I believe that many of the points that she's made are the same lessons that thoughtful Americans, and I hope other thoughtful Pakistanis, have made about learning from the extraordinary difficulties that we've had in the last couple of years. The way I'd like to outline it is to talk about two ways in which I think we've had difficulties and that we need to face up to some hard truths. Ones that I think Ambassador Maleeha Lodhi has alluded to, but then talk about different opportunities in two ways that we can move ahead ourselves. The first is that there has been a tendency, as you mentioned, for America to see Pakistan through the lens of the counterterrorism fight. There's been a tendency that was mentioned here to have an overwhelming or perhaps even disproportionate view of Afghanistan and Pakistan, thus the AFPAC construction. Understand, this comes from an America that does look at its role in regional and in fact global ways, which sees its future in this part of the world, not simply thinking of these countries, but of the problems that come here. The issue of militants, those heirs of the people who attacked us in 9/11, those heirs of people who have done so much damage, in our opinion, to the openness and to the tolerance and to the safety of your society, the society of a country that's our friend, that has been damaged so badly by those very same people. This has been an important issue for us, but as Ambassador Lodhi has said, and I agree, we have perhaps emphasized this too much in a disproportionate way that hasn't allowed us to have a balanced relationship with Pakistan, or hasn't achieved the balance that we would like to achieve. Because the point is that in 2008, when far-thinking people like John Kerry, like Joseph Biden, like Dick Lugar, like Howard Berman, members of our Congress who are longtime friends of Pakistan, people who know about the narrative, the negative stereotype of Pakistan, and wanted to do something about it, they sought to put together an assistance program which would balance out that overwhelming sense that we saw this part of the world strictly in counterterrorism terms. That is to say, we wanted to make sure that we and our Pakistani friends were well equipped in fighting those people who would do us harm. But in addition, what we wanted to do is get beyond the immediate threat and to try to invest in building or helping to build a country where rule of law, where prosperity, where opportunity, where a general sense of self-confidence could come that would allow Pakistan to deal with its neighbors like India, not from a position of fear, but from a position of confidence that it had something to offer, rather than have feeling that it was somehow threatened. This investment, I'll be honest with you, and I take a certain amount of responsibility for it myself because I was here during these areas, was not the success we wanted it to be. It was not the success we wanted to be because our attempt to try through what was, we thought, a very generous assistance program was either misunderstood, rightly or wrongly, by many elites in this country who saw it as an infringement on their freedom. Perhaps they understood the germ of what Ambassador Lodi was talking about, that assistance by its very definition creates imbalance in relationships, and that people who are on the receiving end of assistance perhaps have the psychological problem that's very, very difficult to get out from under. And in our altruism, in our effort to try to say, okay, we see problems and we want to help, maybe what we were doing was contributing to that imbalanced relationship. And so there are some elements out of goodwill that we weren't able to achieve, and perhaps it's time, and we have realized now, that it's time to reassess that. I think from the Pakistani side, it's time also to reassess that it wasn't simply that the Americans were coming and throwing away money. I can't tell you how many times I traveled in this country and people would say, you know, your famous Kerry Lugar Berman, I haven't seen any of it, right? Hundreds of schools have been built. Hundreds of turbines have been fixed. Hundreds of people were given new equipment or livelihood after the floods of 2010. And we didn't do a very good job of publicizing that. But I think, in a way, what I get as a broader question reinforces what Ambassador Lodi has said. It may be time that if we truly love Pakistan, and if we truly want to see Pakistan stand on its feet, that the effort that we made, which was in good faith to try to build the long-term capacity of Pakistan, needs to be built in a different way, and that we need to look a lot less at assistance, which psychologically brings that sense of humiliation, whether we mean to or not, and that we put away the question of the anger or the resentment that Pakistan says, when we, on the other hand, at a time when we have terrible spending problems in the United States, are committed to spending money on Pakistan. So let's take a good look at that on both sides and see that our effort that we made from beginning in 2008 needs reassessment, that realism that I think that Ambassador Lodi is talking about. So those two areas to begin with, that we focus a little bit less on the primacy, important as it is, of the counterterrorism fight, and balance it with our commitment to a strong and stable Pakistan that we meant to do from the time after 2008. And secondly, that in our way of dealing with Pakistan in this broader way, that we try to get away from a structure that almost begins to guarantee a sense that we're building in an inequality between our two countries. I absolutely agree with Ambassador Lodi that when she says we have come to a point where we are being much clearer with each other, where we're being a little more sober. I think the relationship actually has calmed down. I don't like to think that it's a result of my departure. I like to think though that we went through some very difficult days between the end of 2010 and the middle of 2012, and that we as good friends with lots of things in common are now able to have a quieter, sometimes less ambitious, but perhaps more effective relationship. So if we're able to kind of recast the relationship very much along the lines that Ambassador Lodi mentioned, with the do's and don'ts that she mentioned, it's hard for me to find anything wrong with that agenda. I would only say that there's one kind of dimension that I would like to stress a little bit more. When I speak of Pakistan, and when I was a diplomat, we talk about what's called a Westphalian vision in diplomacy of states. That is, you talk about Pakistan as a state, and it's a thing. It's a thing run by a president and a foreign minister and a military. It's a unitary thing. Or you talk about America as a country. America thinks this, or America thinks that. I don't buy that. Now, fortunately, I don't work for the US government anymore. I'm retired, so I'm allowed to say this. But I would have said that, and I think many of you would have said it as well. Here's the point I'm trying to make. The relationship between America and Pakistan, when it is limited, when it is defined as a government-to-government relationship, and I'm using government in the very general sense, the institutions of government, it's limited, and I would argue it may contribute to the fact that we haven't done so well with each other. Because the really tough issues we're dealing with, your military dealing with the attacks on your people in the Fatah, We don't want to see them. We try to work with you. We haven't always done a good job. But this is a serious issue. Your problems dealing with the fact that lights go out in your country because of the energy crisis. We wanted to deal with it well. We haven't done such a great job. The lights are still going out despite all the money we've spent and all the efforts we've tried to deal with. In other words, if we see this strictly as the task of governments, I don't think we're doing enough or we're doing it the right way. I'd like to suggest that we think of each other as much more as the links between our societies, and that we go beyond the realm of just looking for government-to-government solutions. Specifically, the mention you made of people-to-people programs, sometimes people dismiss this. They say, oh, it's feel-good, it's sure, who's against people-to-people programs? I see the general effort by social groups and social institutions as the strongest thing both countries have. What Americans like about Pakistanis is that they're great businessmen, is that they're great academics, they're great students, they're fun people to be with, they have great Qawwali music, they do good things, they're culturally sophisticated, warm people. That's a picture we have of ourselves. We think we're pretty good at education. We have great universities. We have students who are curious about other parts of the world. We have businessmen everywhere in the world who are working in innovative areas. To me, that's the face of America that I would argue most Pakistanis, even as they complain about what's happened over the last couple of years, have always told me, that's the America I like. That's the America I want to be friends with. And I think it goes both ways. Sadly, too few Americans have the pleasure that we do coming here and being with you on a beautiful day in Karachi. And we need to change that as well. But those Americans who do know Pakistanis feel the same way. Pakistanis are, it sounds corny, they're nice people who know how to do a deal in business and know how to keep their word, and they know how to respect the culture of other people. I used the example of Qawwali music. Qawwali music fuses very well with jazz. This is an international kind of thing that I think is the essence of your culture. If we limit our ties to military relationships, to the cooperation of the CIA and the ISI, to the diplomatic ties, even though I dearly love working with my diplomatic colleagues, if that's the limit of what we do with one another, we're not playing with our strong suit. Our strong suit is our social links, people to people. So that, I believe, is something that as we recreate the relationship, this realistic relationship we want to see, that we put more effort, if we can, into business ties, university links we've had for decades that have fallen into disuse, cultural links, etc. Those kinds of areas where the city of Karachi and the city where I now live, Los Angeles, two great diverse places by the side of the sea, that's where the link ought to be, because that's where the affinity, in my mind, is natural. So that's one of my suggestions. That's one of my do's that I've given. My second do is something that I think those of you who heard me talk yesterday heard me emphasize, and I'll say it again. The perniciousness of these national dialogues is that we focus on each other, and I think you used the word neurosis. Yes, on both sides. We have neuroses about each other. And part of it is that when we define things in the rut of bilateral visions, here's America, here's Pakistan, and there's no one else in the world. We're stuck in this room with one light over us, and it's like being interrogated. We can obsess about this all we want, and believe me, generations of book writers have. Let them do that. I would like to see if we can take as many of the issues that we face and put them in broader context, we would be wise. I'm not trying to say that in the India-Pakistan relationship that America needs to get out in front. Far from it. If we get out in front in the India-Pakistan relationship, we're just going to screw it up. It's not for us. It's for you and India to deal with. But we and other friends of Pakistan can be supportive if you will have the leadership and if you will ask us, can you support us? Not, will you solve this? I don't like it when people came to me as ambassador and said, I want you to fix Kashmir. You owe it to us. No, we don't. We don't. There's no solution that can be brought in from the outside. It has to be India and Pakistan showing the leadership and the confidence, and us being ready as good friends to follow. Similarly, in Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan can't be solved just by America and Pakistan. Our friends in the region, and any other number of countries, Turkey, China, Iran. They also have a role as well. So my second ask, my second do here is let's see as much as we can if we can talk about problems that interest us both in an international context, multilateral contexts, so it gets us away from that obsession that we have about looking in the mirror every 5 minutes about our own relationship. Let's talk about the tasks, and let's not obsess about ourselves. Where the bilateral relationship is useful, great, because we can be good friends. But it's not all about us. That kind of narcissism is a real problem, and we should get away from it. So those are my two suggestions. You heard the assessment that I had at the beginning, very much in line with what Ambassador Lodi had. And I, for one, and I would hope that she would agree with me, I'm optimistic that what we see after 2014, the prospect of moving after 2014, is that we can actually recreate a relationship here in the region that can be seen as a pretty nice departure from the difficulties we've had in these last couple of days. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Manto. Maybe we can have a short discussion before we move to the question and answer session. Ambassador Lodi, I would like to ask you, as you mentioned that our interests are not always perfectly aligned. And if you look at our history, prior to 9/11, the major dispute or the source of problems with the US was military intervention. And before that, it was the nuclear issue. But as of now, the nuclear issue, the United States seems to have accepted that it can at least be put in cold storage, and we already have a democracy. So after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, do you find that we have more shared interests and less sources of friction, or are there still potential pitfalls to the relationship after 2014?
I think, as I said, much will depend on how 2014 itself plays out. That will be critical in determining the future course of the relationship. If, for example, let's look at the most positive scenario. The most positive scenario would be an Afghanistan where the fighting ends well ahead of 2014, where the core group of countries, as they're called, Pakistan, United States, and the Afghan government, are able to help an Afghan peace process that leads to a political accommodation within Afghanistan, so that we avoid the kind of worst case scenario which actually played itself out in the 90s in our region. Right. If this best case scenario materializes, this is the best basis on which I think we can predicate a future relationship. But if it doesn't, because remember, there'll be two aspects of the next few months even. The safe, secure withdrawal of NATO US forces from Afghanistan, which, as we know, President Obama has now committed to accelerate. Half the troops will be out in the next year. Pakistan's role is going to be critical in ensuring that we can reduce, if I can use that expression, if we can reduce American pain as they get out. Okay? So that's one aspect. The other is, as I said, waging peace or forging peace. Then, of course, it will be affected by the 2-3 other factors that I mentioned. Pakistan's own trajectory. I mean, we can't disconnect national from international relations. And we cannot always keep looking for bailouts as a substitute for actions we have to take ourselves. I think that's when we put ourselves in a situation where we become a virtual supplicant in the eyes of many in Congress. So you sever that part of the relationship, redeem your honor, reform yourself, and you're on a much better plane to have a more solid relationship with not just the United States, with other countries. Thirdly, as I also mentioned, and I can elaborate a little bit on this, which is the pivot to China or the pivot to Asia. If the United States is moving into an era which is an era, in any case, of shifting centers of global power. Global power is much more diffuse. America's unipolar moment ended a long time ago. As America itself acknowledges, it does not have the ability now to achieve outcomes. It could not do that in Iraq. It could not do it in Afghanistan. So might is not always right, and military solutions don't always work, something which is acknowledged by President Obama since he's one of the things that he committed to doing was to end America's involvement in 2 wars. That was his words, not ours. Now, this is music to our ears. Because guess who had said, please don't have such a long, protracted war? It was Pakistan. And sometimes we forget our own history. We were the ones who asked the United States, even in those hours after 9/11, please think of another way to resolve this rather than going to war. We understand what you have gone through. It is a tragedy of a monumental order, but find a diplomatic solution because no war is a smart war. There is no war that is waged in which there are no civilian casualties and the innocent don't die. Don't punish a whole country for the sake of a group, a network. Obviously our counsel was not heeded, but I think we need to remind ourselves we did do that. We were not listened to, fine. But now that the United States itself is standing where we were standing 11 years ago, which is they're saying there is no military solution, we would like a political settlement, we'd like to leave Afghanistan. So I think this is a convergent area. But the China factor, I think, will loom very large, in my opinion, because I think if the containment of China leads to the United States, I hope it doesn't, but if it leads the United States to old balance of power kind of international politics, which frankly, the era of that is over. This is not a balance of power world anymore in that sense of the word. Power is much more diffused now in so many different ways. It's diffused between countries and within countries also. So to expect that they can then build certain countries as counterweights to China, will confront Pakistan with with dilemmas actually. Because Pakistan, for a start, will not sign up to any containment of China policy. And Pakistan will resist any effort to try to impose any kind of regional hegemon onto Pakistan. I mean, this is not, we'd like peace with everybody, but we'd like peace in an honorable way. So I think there are many factors which are unknown in the future. We'll have to see how policy emerges. And I think what most Pakistanis will be looking towards Washington now is, we'd like to see your Pakistan policy, because you haven't had one for 10 years. So it'd be nice to see what it looks like. And we too, I think, have an opportunity. I don't think we should shift everything on to others. We have an opportunity. We have a new government which is going to come in after these elections. The elections are a critical turning point for Pakistan in many ways. Let the new government also see what is the best basis on which it can also engage with the United States. I think if the United States had no Pakistan policy, Pakistan also had no policy for the fact that this century is Asia's century. So it has a great relationship with China, so that's a very large chunk of Asia. But it also needs a much more robust Asia policy, and it should get used to what the whole world is used to. The world is looking east. They're rushing to Asia. That's the continent of opportunity, of the future. It's Asia's century, remember? And I think some parts of Pakistan's elite still look towards, they're obsessed with the West. And yet the West itself is saying, the West has now, power is shifting from the West to the rest. So it's an interesting thing that we also have to assess for ourselves.
Cameron, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I think one of the themes, I think it's excellent advice. Pakistan has to have its own Pakistan policy. Help us a little bit. And by that, I mean, I'm joking, but not really. What we're looking for is a country that respects itself. If you want to be respected, respect yourself. And I say this as a friend of Pakistan. I don't see enough self-respect in Pakistan. And I think this is something that's very possible.
I think I'd like to jump in here, because I think, Ambassador Munter, we agree on most points. And I would agree on this one too, but I think you speak only for the elite of Pakistan. The people of Pakistan have great honor and respect. They have great confidence in themselves. They're dynamic people. We are a resilient society. Where we have been failed is by the state, those who have managed the state. Pakistan, one of my favorite lines, it's not mine, I borrowed it from somebody, is Pakistan is not so much a poor country as a poorly managed country. So we,
If I could add to that, this is precisely the point I make, because the self-respect in a cultural sense is not at all the question. Yeah. The question is that respect that I'm looking for, and I think that you have latently, is the respect, as you say, to run your affairs correctly, to be the kind of partner that is clear to other people, and Pakistan's not unique. Every country has those difficulties. But if we are able to come up with a sense of Pakistani leadership and confidence, a sense that those kinds of issues in domestic reform are really being tackled by honest people of goodwill, then those issues, how can we help with energy? If we have faith that you're really taking the lead in dealing with energy. How do we help with education? If your leadership, is taking the lead. That's the only effective way to have this kind of change. And that's the point I was trying to make about respect. I think in the general sense, this question about the pivot towards Asia is very, very important. Pakistan has two great friends, America and China. Nice position to be in that sense. There are very many places in the world where there may be American and Chinese differences of opinion about some issue, some international issue. Not Pakistan. The way I understand Chinese interests here is they're interested in your prosperity and their own prosperity here with you. They're interested in making sure that the militant challenge that you face does not spread to China. But look, those things are things that America wants too. We have great common cause with China here, and not just with China. If you talk to our friends in Turkey, very similar. So Pakistan has friends, and when I say don't just obsess with America, it's not a question that America wants to go away. We'd like to contribute with other countries to have the same agenda to work with you internationally.
I think we've overrun our time a little bit. Can we have a few questions before the session ends? Just a gentleman in the white shirt. You can start there.
Thank you, sir. I've got two very short questions. One is that Dr. Lodhi suggested that the US and Pakistan should work to avoid nuclear arms race in South Asia. So I would like to ask that is it in the hands of US or Pakistan alone to avoid an arms race here in South Asia, or we need other actors to act accordingly? Plus, sir, how do you view drone attacks? If 5 or 10 years down the lane, Russia, China, or Israel maybe conduct similar drone operations, would the US be able to live with that? Thank you.
Would you like to take that first?
Well, I'll start with the second question. Very sensitive issue. Every country has to deal with terrorism as it can, using the tools it can. The key on this issue for me has been, and what has been disappointing about the difficulties of the last couple of years, is that Pakistan and America, who suffer from the same threat, the same people who are attacking our people, who are attacking your shrines, and trying to undercut your way of life as well as ours, are people we should unite against. And the sad part about the tensions we've had is we haven't been able to cooperate as well as we should on counterterrorism. I think it's led to the questions that you've raised about people wondering about the future of that particular technology. But I think the key on this issue is not the technology itself. It's how the governments talk to one another and realize that they, with respect, can attack the same problem in the same way. On the nuclear issue, I'll pass it over to the expert here.
I think you ask a very good question. The reason I mentioned that as a stated goal was that neither country wants to see this region, South Asia, engage in an open-ended arms race, whether it's conventional or nuclear. And the reason I had said that was that then US policies will also have to be in sync with this goal. And what we've seen in the last few years is the US act in a non-even-handed way in our region. It has actually forged a deal which was contrary to the non-proliferation regime and had a nuclear supply group agreement as well as an Indo-US civilian nuclear deal, which maybe inadvertently fueled certain anxieties which are security concerns in Pakistan, compelling Pakistan to take certain actions in response. And therefore, it has all the ingredients. I mean, I hope the two countries will not go down that road. But here you can see either it's the law of unintended consequences or it is the law of intended consequences. But if US behavior in our region helps build up asymmetries which are already there, and it begins to accentuate these asymmetries, then the question that has to be asked the United States is, but you said your goal was to avert an arms race. What you're doing is actually the opposite. So your words and your actions are not quite in sync. But I was speaking as much about the stated objectives, and then I also said, if the United States does not conduct even-handed policies or balanced policies in our region, it will have certain consequences, and it will also inevitably affect the bilateral relationship. So I think we have to keep these points in view as we look ahead.
Time
I
for
think
a few
we're in a
more
better place than we were 2 years ago, as Ambassador Manto also agrees, but it's still a place which is very fraught. We haven't fixed this relationship by any stretch of the imagination. We're just in a better place, that's it.
One more question.
One quick word on that, which
Gray
is,
shirt.
I agree almost always with Ambassador Lodi. I have some disagreements with her assessment of nuclear policy here. But rather than going into them, I think it's one of those reasons, as she says, why we have to have very close talks, why we can't afford to get estranged. Because the American notion of Pakistani's nuclear program, Pakistani's history with proliferation, these kinds of problems, is very serious with us, and it needs to be harmonized, I think, with Pakistan's notion of its own role and the security of the region. We're not there yet, so it's a good illustration that we have work to do, but I think we can do it.
Okay. Yeah, in the gray shirt, please. Yeah.
Excellency, my name is Mehdi Masood. I'm a former diplomat. May I say that while we are thankful and appreciate the aid, we are thankful for the aid given by the West and the outside world, we would like you to appreciate that there is no comparison between the price that is paid by Pakistan in economic, strategic and political terms with any aid that we have received in totality. There is no comparison, while being very grateful. We hope that you will give due consideration to this. Otherwise, this disparity will continue to militate against our interests and against progress in our relationship. And secondly, you know there is complete fall and reduction in foreign investment in Pakistan. Reduction in aid in Pakistan on the ground that unless law and order and terrorism are controlled, investment cannot come. But this is a vicious circle, because if investment dries off, it makes it even more difficult for us to fight militancy and poverty and terrorism. It's a vicious circle. If you wait for militancy to be curbed before you start giving the sort of investment which was coming here before the past few years. So I hope that you will please give consideration to this point also. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. Yeah, we agree that you can't buy love with money, and that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is build a relationship built on mutual respect, and despite all the difficulties we've had, that is, I think, a common goal.
I just want to add one thing. I don't know how many of you, because I see a lot of young people, how many of you remember that Beatles song, Money Can't Buy Love? And I think that's what we need to do. I mean, for us Pakistanis, we need to generate our own resources. Stop complaining all the time to somebody else. You will put yourself into the position of a supplicant. Do you as a country want to be a supplicant? I mean, my own take is, and I think opinion polls show that while the elites of Pakistan pursue Washington for money, the people of Pakistan don't wish to see that relationship based on money. They want a relationship, as Ambassador Manto used the word, they want a relationship of honor. There is no honor when you are a recipient of aid, let me tell you. There is no pride and there is no honor.
Yes. Thank you.
Hello.
I think that's a very good
My
point.
question is...
We have time for one last question. Yes.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me a opportunity over. My question is for Ms. Lodi. I just wanted to know your opinion, because since couple of the years we have been seeing most of the Islamist organizations and groups and multiple political parties are moving, also sponsored by the Saudi Arabia and establishment of Pakistan. And they are making the opinion among the people against the America. In such situation, how can you expect from USA and moving for coexistence with Pakistan?
I think for me, the most important issue ahead is going to be really what will come out of Pakistan's elections. Do we have a government which will give us the ability to govern ourselves better? And the issue that you talk of is part of governance. It's not something that stands alone. Our ability to address our security challenges, I frankly think the existential challenge to Pakistan comes from a deteriorating economy. So we want somebody who puts our economy right, and in the process also deals with obviously these very severe, imposing security challenges. But I'd like to say this has nothing to do with anybody else, or it should not have anything to do with anybody else. It's about us. And we have to frame it correctly. And I also think that it's been now death by analysis. We are the most overdiagnosed country in the world. But we know the cures. We know exactly what we need to do to get ourselves right. We need to raise resources. We have them. We need to tax the rich. The rich are there. We also know they're not taxed. We don't need this assistance. Our overseas Pakistanis send us $14 billion a year in remittances. This is this year's figure. $14 billion pales in, I mean, if you look at the assistance Pakistan gets from everybody, multilateral and bilateral, it's not even half of this amount. It's probably not even a third of this amount. So why are we so obsessed with this assistance? If you cast a relationship with another country in the framework of assistance, this won't work from Afghanistan. It gives Pakistan a unique opportunity, a window. It's a window. It'll close. A window then to see how best it can address its own challenge of militancy in this period. Because this is going to be a window that Pakistan must utilize, but it cannot utilize this if it has the other problems. So really, I think more increasingly, we should frame our issues in terms of our own interests. Without reference to others, they will respect us much more, rather than have to, frame them with reference to foreign policy. This is about us. It's not about them.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question. Can we have the mic to Mr. Amin Hashwani? Excuse me, Mr. Amin Hashwani. We'll go take turns.
Oh, here comes.
Please. Excuse me, sir, please. We'll take turns. Mr. Amin Hashwani, what's your question?
Okay, my question is to both the members of the panel. There is a high degree of paranoia, conspiracy theories, etc., especially with the Pakistan-US relationship. There is paranoia in most societies of the world, but in Pakistan we have a lot of paranoia regarding US conspiracy theories, etc. What would you suggest both the governments and the civil society can do to be it a counter-narrative or to somehow mitigate this issue?
So the question is, about the paranoia, if you will, in the relationship, the poison that's come. Look, a lot of the difficulties of the last couple of years, I'd be the first to admit, were based on errors and problems and mistaken assumptions, and we shouldn't pretend that these problems aren't there. So one way to deal with this is to be honest, and I think we're doing that. I think our governments are making an honest effort to try to deal with one another, to try to assess what's possible and what's not. But in the broader sense of understanding, having a good concept of how we are dealing with each other, I would send you back to the idea that we have to have greater contact between our peoples, between the institutions. You have a vibrant media. You have a pretty extraordinary media in this country. The more your media work with the media of the world globally, accepting the standards, accepting the technology, learning how to be part of a global system, and the talent is there, that's one step towards getting past, I think, a sense that you're mentioning. Another is having business be able to come here. Right now, many foreign businesses are afraid to come here because the image of Pakistan is it's too dangerous. We know that you can be a successful businessman here. Universities, as I mentioned before, the more students from America who come here, not just students from here who come to America, the better they're going to understand the opportunities and the people here. The antidote for what you talk about, the antidote for the mistrust is more contact across society, not just at elite levels, so that people can reaffirm what I think is a tradition of friendship between our countries and find those areas that we have in common. It's going to take a very long time, and as Ambassador Lodi said, Americans are not known for their patience, right? But if you, who are known for your patience, will be patient with us, I think it's worth it.
Would you like to respond?
I think you raise a good question, Amin, but I would sort of address it in a similar fashion, but first point out and endorse what Ambassador Manta said, that paranoia emerges in a certain context. It doesn't sort of drop out of the sky. Paranoia emerges because there have been a series of experiences and incidents that lead people then to believe certain things, however fanciful they may be. So I think I don't need to go into that because we know the history of ups and downs and the turbulence. The second reason, I think sometimes it's fanned. And I often call this obsession with the outside world at the expense of our own problems. I've often called it, maybe I see too many movies, I call it fatal distraction. It's fatal because we're so distracted by what's happening and what are they doing to us that we usually forget what we're doing to ourselves. Okay? We need to deal with both, no question about it. You need to deal with the external as well as the internal. But I think some of it gets fanned in that manner. And the third is, there's nothing quite as sexy for a lot of people in the media as conspiracy theories. So let's face it, Pakistan's broadcast media it's evolving. It has to still come of age. So sometimes you see, for example, I saw, this has nothing to do with Pak-US relations, but it's a good example. For almost 2 weeks, talk shows are going on and on and on and on about the elections are not going to be held on time. But why shouldn't they be held on time? Who doesn't want elections on time? And yet talk show, and there's a paranoia that's built up. But if you go out into the street and ask somebody or ask your cook, are you worried? And he said, no, I'll cast my vote, I'm registered, there's no problem. So it's interesting how sometimes these are disconnects, sometimes they are fatal distractions, and sometimes they do emerge from a national experience. And I'll end on this note. When you have, for example, they say Pakistan, or many Pakistanis have a paranoia that the US wants to get hold of its nukes. It's one of the things that are said. Okay. But when you have a book published in America called Obama's Wars, and it's written by one of the most respected journalists who has clearly been briefed, not leaked, briefed by the White House, because he can't have all that information, and which contains paragraphs upon paragraphs about unnamed US officials going on about Pakistan's nukes. You kind of wonder, or maybe you don't wonder then, that some Pakistanis are then justified into at least asking, what is this? Why do we find you saying this about ourselves? Or if we find leading congressmen making statements. Now, we know Ambassador Manta, just like in our country, Maulana Fazlur Rahman doesn't always speak for the people of Pakistan. He speaks for a certain section of opinion. So we also know you have your equivalents, shall we say. But at the same time, some of them speak on the basis of briefings they've received. And then the Pakistani government or the Pakistani people, I think, are justified in asking, what does this mean? What are your intentions? And I think now we are in a phase where we're able to at least say that we should share our views about what each other's strategic intentions are going forward. So I think, as I said before, we're in a better place.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time, Ambassador Lodhi. I think we have run out of time, so we'll wrap it up.
Yes. Just a final word on that. This is one of those tough issues we shouldn't run away. As you can imagine, I have some differences of opinion with Ambassador Lodhi. And in fact, I wouldn't be a good American if I didn't have differences of opinion with many of you and many other Americans. That's something I like about both of our countries. But I am confident, I think as we've said, that we're on the road to being able to have a mature, a calm, and a respectful dialogue about that. That's the sine qua non. Because if we don't have that, I'll guarantee you we're going to have more problems. But with that, we have a chance. So thank you all for all the efforts you're making, and thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Malia.